Hi, I'm Leo, and I watched a team of elite Air Force mechanics laugh at my 11-year-old sister, Ilara, just as they were about to give up on two wounded men. They had all the advanced computers and years of experience, but they were deaf to what the machine was actually saying. The truth was humming right in front of them, a quiet, insistent whisper that their pride and their protocols made it impossible for them to hear. It was a sound only she could recognize, a sound that held the key to life and death. Have you ever been in a room full of experts knowing you had the answer, but your voice was too small to be heard? Before I tell you how Ilara used a simple wrench from our dad's old toolkit to silence those smirks, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the look on their faces when that engine finally roared to life. The problem was Angel 1, our base's only UH-60 Black Hawk. It was our lifeline. A recon team was stranded on the eastern ridge. A blizzard was minutes away and two of them were bleeding out. The air in the hangar was thick with the smell of failure, a mix of cold metal, jet fuel, and the bitter sweat of panic. Every attempt to start the engine ended with the same pathetic cough, a death rattle that echoed the fate of the men on that mountain. And in the middle of all this chaos was my sister, Ilara. To everyone else, she was just a ghost, the cook's quiet daughter. She'd drift around the hangars, her small frame swallowed by our dad's old jacket, clutching the worn leather toolkit that was her only real inheritance from him. They saw a kid, a civilian nuisance in a high-stakes military operation. They didn't see the hours she spent with Dad, her head buried in grease-stained Black Hawk manuals, learning the language of engines not as a hobby, but as a way to keep his memory alive. She wasn't playing. She was studying, listening, continuing a conversation that death had interrupted. Her connection to machines was her last connection to him. The so-called experts were a team of pararescue mechanics, the best of the best, flown in specifically for this. They were all confidence and swagger when they arrived, plugging in laptops and running diagnostics with an air of professional superiority. But as minutes turned into an hour, their confidence curdled into raw frustration. They barked at each other, their voices sharp with blame. They declared the main turbine was shot, a catastrophic failure. It was a death sentence for the mission, a technical way of saying they had given up. They were so focused on their digital readouts and complex procedures that they had stopped listening to the machine itself. They were trying to command it, not understand it, and their arrogance was about to cost good men their lives. I saw Ilara approach one of the lead mechanics, a master sergeant with a face like chiseled granite. She was so small, she barely reached his waist. She tugged gently on his sleeve and whispered something, her voice almost lost in the hangar's anxious hum. I was too far to hear the exact words, but I saw his reaction clearly. He didn't even look down at her. He just scoffed, a short, ugly sound, and waved a dismissive hand. "Get out of here, kid. We're busy. Go play with your dolls." The words hit her like a physical blow. I saw her flinch, her shoulders slumping as she retreated back into the shadows, her face a mask of quiet hurt. It was the ultimate humiliation, being told she was a child playing games while men's lives were on the line. Major Thorne stood near the command console, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. He was a good man, a commander who felt the weight of every soldier under his command, but he was trapped by protocol and the expert opinion of the mechanics. He listened to them give their final, grim assessment, his jaw tight. The radio crackled with a weak, desperate transmission from the stranded team, their voices fading against the rising wind of the blizzard. Thorne's gaze swept across the hangar, a look of pure, agonizing helplessness on his face. He was seconds away from making the call, from officially aborting the rescue and condemning his men to the storm. The air grew still, heavy with the finality of it all. This was the moment hope died. She retreated, but only physically. Her eyes never left the Black Hawk. I could see the gears turning in her head. Her brow furrowed in deep concentration. The sergeant's dismissal had stung her, I knew it had, but the engine's wrongness stung her more. It was a puzzle screaming the wrong answer, and she simply couldn't walk away from it. She clutched her father's toolkit tighter, the cold, worn leather a familiar comfort against her small palm. It was as if she was channeling him, his patience, his deep, intuitive knowledge of these machines. While every adult in that hangar was busy accepting defeat and moving on to the grim reality of failure, she was running through a mental checklist, replaying the sound of the engine's sputtering failure in her mind. isolating a discordant note that only she seemed to hear. She decided to try a different approach, a softer one. She sidled up to a young medic, a corporal who looked barely out of his teens, his face etched with the same raw helplessness as everyone else's. I watched her point towards the engine, her expression pleading, her small hands making a twisting motion. The medic actually listened, leaning down, his eyes showing a flicker of genuine curiosity. For a single, breathtaking second, a spark of hope ignited in my chest. But then he glanced over his shoulder at the Master Sergeant, who was glaring in their direction with undisguised hostility. The medic's posture straightened instantly. He gave Ilara a small, apologetic shake of his head and quickly stepped away, busying himself with a medical kit that didn't need organizing. He chose the safety of the hierarchy over the impossible chance that she was right. The elite mechanics began their slow, shameful retreat, packing up their high-tech diagnostic gear. They moved with a forced, almost arrogant casualness, but their clipped words and sharp movements betrayed their deeply wounded professional pride. "Old bird like this," one of them muttered, loud enough for several of us to hear, "should have been decommissioned years ago. We can't work miracles." Another chimed in, blaming the extreme cold, the altitude, anything but their own inability to solve the core problem. They were closing ranks, building a wall of technical excuses and regulations to protect their reputations from the stain of this failure. Their scorn wasn't just for the machine anymore. It was for the whole situation, for this remote base, and for the silent, staring child in the corner who, with her very presence, seemed to be a judgment on their celebrated expertise. Major Thorne finally lifted the radio handset to his mouth, and the hangar fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Every single eye was on him. The only sound was the howling wind outside, a mocking reminder of the storm that was about to claim his men. "Ridge Team, this is command." Thorne's voice was gravelly, hollowed out by a defeat that felt absolute. "Angel 1 is a no-go. I repeat, Angel 1 is a no-go." He paused, and in that terrible pause, I felt the collective hope in the room just evaporate. It was gone. "We are assessing alternate options. Stand by." But we all knew what that meant. There were no alternate options. It was a death sentence delivered over a crackling radio, a formal surrender to the mountain, and I had to stand there and watch it all unfold, knowing my little sister was holding the key. That was the moment something inside Ilara finally snapped. The quiet, observant girl vanished, replaced by a fierce, desperate energy I had never seen before. She ran out from the shadows, her small boots pounding on the cold concrete floor, stopping right in the middle of the hangar. She didn't whisper this time. She yelled, her voice surprisingly powerful, cutting through the morbid silence like a warning siren. "It's not the turbine!" Every head whipped towards her, a sea of shocked, disbelieving faces. "You're all deaf, you're listening for a roar, but you need to hear the whisper." Her words hung in the frigid air, a shocking accusation against the best of the best. It wasn't a suggestion anymore. It was a raw, unfiltered declaration of war against their expertise, against their failure. The Master Sergeant was the first to recover from the shock, and his face contorted with pure, unadulterated fury. He strode towards Ilara, his finger jabbing the air just inches from her face. "That's it. I told you to get out of here, you little brat," he roared, his voice booming in the cavernous space. "This is a restricted military zone, not a playground for some cook's kid. You have no idea what you're talking about, and you are interfering with a critical operation." He was towering over her, his anger a physical force, trying to intimidate her into silence. He was making an example of her, using his rage to deflect from his own incompetence. In that moment, she wasn't just being ignored. She was being publicly shamed and accused for daring to have an answer when the experts had none. But his tirade was cut short by Major Thorne's voice. It was quiet, but it carried the unmistakable weight of absolute command. "Sergeant, stand down." The sergeant froze, his mouth half open, turning to the major in utter disbelief. Thorne's face was a mask of utter exhaustion. He had nothing left to lose. His men were dying, his experts had failed him, and protocol was now just a useless piece of paper. He looked from the fuming sergeant to my tiny, defiant sister, who hadn't flinched or cried. He saw not a child, but the last, impossible flicker of hope in a world that had gone dark. He walked slowly towards her, his boots echoing in the tense silence until he stood right in front of her. He knelt down so his eyes were level with hers. "Show me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Show me the whisper." A wave of hostile silence fell over the hangar. The sergeant's face was a thundercloud of fury, but Major Thorne's quiet order had frozen him in place. Ilara didn't hesitate for a second. With the Major's permission, she walked directly toward the silent black. Hawk, her small figure a stark contrast to the massive machine. I followed a few steps behind her, my hands clenched into fists, ready to step in if any of the mechanics so much as breathed on her wrong. They were muttering amongst themselves, their voices low but dripping with scorn. "This is a circus," one of them hissed. "He's letting a kid touch a multi-million-dollar asset." Their pride was so wounded that they preferred to watch men die rather than admit a child might see something they had missed. She ignored them completely. Her focus was absolute, a bright, intense light in the dim hangar. She didn't glance at the cockpit's array of dark screens or the diagnostic laptops the mechanics had abandoned. Instead, she went straight to the side of the aircraft, to the engine housing itself. She reached out and placed her small, bare palm flat against the cold metal casing, right over the auxiliary power unit. She closed her eyes, her brow furrowed in concentration. For a long, tense moment, she just stood there listening. On Thorne's nod, the pilot initiated the startup sequence one more time. We all heard it again. The high-pitched whine, the hopeful churn, and then the same pathetic sputtering cough that sealed the men's fate. But this time, Ilara's eyes snapped open and there was a flash of triumphant certainty in them. "There," she whispered, turning to Thorne. "It's starving. The starter's fuel line." The master sergeant couldn't contain himself. He let out a short, ugly bark of a laugh. "Starving? Kid, we ran the fuel diagnostics 3 times. The pressure is nominal all the way to the injectors. The computer says the flow is perfect." He was talking to Major Thorne, but his glare was fixed on Ilara, trying to belittle her in front of the commander. "You're pointing at a secondary preheater line for the APU. It's a non-critical component. The problem is a catastrophic failure in the main turbine ignition. Our gear doesn't lie. We are telling you, sir, this bird is not going to fly." He was desperate to re-establish his authority, to drag the situation back to the world he understood, a world of regulations, readouts, and rank, where a child's intuition was worth less than nothing. Ilara didn't even look at him. She just shook her head, her gaze fixed on the Major. "The computer isn't lying," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through his bluster. "It's just being lied to." She pulled a small, heavy-duty flashlight from a pocket in her dad's old jacket and aimed its bright, focused beam at a small, almost invisible component tucked away near the APU's exhaust. It was a tiny metallic nub, no bigger than a fingernail. "That's the thermal sensor for the pre-ignition fuel line," she explained. "It's supposed to stop the fuel from freezing before it gets to the starter. Look closely." And as we all leaned in, the powerful beam of light revealed it. A delicate, perfectly clear coating of ice encasing the sensor and the tiny pipe it was attached to. It was so thin and uniform it looked like a factory finish. A stunned silence fell over the mechanics. You could practically hear their arrogance shattering like thin glass. It was a problem so simple, so brutally physical, that their sophisticated diagnostics, programmed to hunt for complex electronic ghosts, had been completely blind to it. They had been searching for a dragon and had missed the snake at their feet. The master sergeant's face went from red with anger to a pasty, sickly white. The smug certainty drained away, leaving a slack-jawed emptiness. He was staring at the undeniable proof of his own failure, a tiny crystal of ice that had defeated millions of dollars in technology and a lifetime of experience. In that moment he looked smaller than my sister. The sheer elemental simplicity of the problem had stripped him of all his authority. Ilara, however, showed no sign of triumph. She was still just a girl fixing a machine. Her focus remained entirely on the task at hand, her voice calm as she explained the mechanics of the failure to Major Thorne, as if he were one of her father's students. "The main engine's de-icing system is working fine, but this little bypass line must have a clogged vent. Ice formed, and the sensor told the computer the line was warm and clear. The computer, trusting the sensor, reported normal fuel flow. But the fuel inside the pipe was frozen solid. The APU was being starved, and its safety protocols were shutting the whole ignition sequence down to prevent a dry fire. It was just doing its job." She then reached into her father's worn leather toolkit and pulled out a small, specialized wrench. its handle worn smooth with use. She didn't ask for a ladder. She simply reached up on her toes, her arm stretched to its limit. With a steady hand, she positioned the wrench over the iced-over sensor housing. She gave it one single, sharp, perfectly calculated tap. It wasn't a hard blow. It was precise, confident, the kind of motion you see from someone who has done the same thing 1,000 times. The thin shell of ice cracked instantly and fell away in a tiny, glittering cascade. It was an almost absurdly simple solution to a problem that had grounded an entire military operation and condemned 2 men to death. She pulled her hand back, wiped it on her jacket, and then looked over to the pilot in the cockpit. She gave him a small, definitive nod. A new kind of silence descended on the hangar, not of despair, but of breathless, heart-pounding anticipation. The pilot, a man with a 1,000-yard stare etched onto his face, looked from the control panel to Major Thorne. His hand hovered over the ignition switch, a moment of profound hesitation. He was being asked to trust a child over his instruments, over his training, over the combined expertise of the best mechanics in the Air Force. The entire hangar was a vacuum of held breath. The Master Sergeant stood frozen, a statue of pure, humiliated disbelief. I watched the pilot's eyes find Ilara's. She just gave him another small, certain nod. It was all he needed. Major Thorne's voice cut through the tension, firm and clear. "Do it, Lieutenant." The order was given. The choice was made. The fate of those men rested on that single, final attempt. The lieutenant's fingers moved with renewed purpose, flipping a series of switches. The familiar electronic chimes of the pre-start sequence filled the air, but they sounded different this time. They weren't a countdown to another failure. They felt like a prelude to a miracle. I could feel my own heart hammering against my ribs, each beat a prayer. I looked at Ilara. She was a picture of absolute calm, her eyes fixed on the engine housing, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to a private conversation. She wasn't watching the pilot or the major. She was still connected to the machine, her entire being focused on its response. She was waiting for the Black Hawk to answer her, to prove her right, to finally speak in a language everyone could understand. The auxiliary power unit spooled up. The high-pitched whine grew louder and louder, a clean, steady crescendo that filled the cavernous hangar. There was no stutter, no falter, no hint of the strangled struggle from before. It was the sound of a healthy system, a perfect and uninterrupted flow of power. I risked a glance at the Master Sergeant. His eyes were wide, locked on the RPM gauge in the cockpit, which was climbing steadily. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle pulsed violently in his cheek. He was witnessing the impossible, the complete and total dismantling of his professional reality by a little girl with her father's wrench. The air was electric, thick with a hope so fragile you felt a single wrong word could shatter it. "Ignition sequence initiated," the pilot's voice crackled over the internal comms, loud enough for those of us standing near the open cockpit door to hear clearly. Major Thorne stood up slowly, never taking his eyes off the Black Hawk. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand on Ilara's shoulder, a gesture that seemed both protective and grounding, as if he were drawing strength from her quiet certainty. The rest of the hangar was a tableau of frozen figures, a museum of anxious faces, all turned towards the massive, dark machine that held so many lives in its balance. The seconds stretched out, feeling like an eternity. The fate of the men on that frozen ridge, the reputation of the mechanics, the very soul of this base, it all hung in this single, suspended, unbearable moment of silence before the storm. Then came a sound we hadn't heard all day, a deep, resonant thump from the core of the engine, followed immediately by a low, guttural growl. It wasn't the pathetic cough of failure. It was the sound of life, of a predator stirring from a deep sleep. A few of the mechanics physically flinched, not from fear, but from the raw shock of it. One of them, a younger guy who had looked at Ilara with a flicker of sympathy earlier, let out an involuntary gasp. The Master Sergeant took a stumbling half-step back, as if the sound wave itself had physically pushed him. It was the sound of his failure and her success, all rolled into one deep rumbling promise that something much, much bigger was about to happen. The very concrete floor beneath our feet began to vibrate with a new and powerful energy. The growl deepened, escalating with shocking speed into a powerful, ground-shaking roar. The Black Hawk's main rotor blades, which had been still for so long, began to turn. They moved slowly at first, a lazy, heavy arc, then gained momentum with terrifying speed, blurring into a violent, invisible disk above us. A hurricane of wind erupted inside the hangar, a contained tempest that blasted loose papers, dust, and forgotten rags into a chaotic vortex. It whipped our hair and clothes, stinging our faces and forcing us to shield our eyes. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, a glorious, violent symphony of controlled power that drowned out every other sound, every doubt, every last sneer. It was the sound of hope, finally unleashed, raw and untamed and beautiful. Through the rotor wash, I saw the Master Sergeant stumble backward again, his face a perfect mask of utter, stunned incomprehension. He looked from the roaring living machine to my sister, who stood calmly beside Major Thorne, her small frame unmoving in the gale. Her father's old jacket flapped wildly around her, but she didn't even blink. She just watched the helicopter, a small, satisfied smile finally touching her lips as the engines reached their full, stable power. The other mechanics were just staring, their mouths agape, their professional arrogance and scorn blown away like chaff in the wind. The impossible had happened right before their eyes. The whisper had become a roar, and in that single deafening moment, the entire world of that hangar had been irrevocably turned upside down. Major Thorne, his face a mask of raw desperation, just nodded. "Show me." Elara didn't hesitate. She walked right up to the engine casing, ignoring the scornful glares of the mechanics. She didn't point to the main turbine or any of the complex components they had been obsessing over. Instead, her small finger landed on a tiny, almost hidden fuel line near the APU's exhaust port, a piece of hardware so insignificant it wasn't even on the primary. "Diagnostic checklist. It's frozen," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The de-icing system for the main engine is fine, but the thermal sensor for this little starter line is clogged. The computer thinks it's flowing fuel, so the diagnostic reads normal, but it's not. The fuel inside is solid ice. The system is just protecting itself." The Master Sergeant let out a sound that was half scoff, half groan. He stepped forward, his face flushed with a desperate need to reclaim his authority. "That's impossible, Major. That's a non-critical bypass line. It wouldn't cause a full ignition failure. Our diagnostics ran a full pressure and temperature check on the entire fuel system. It would have flagged an anomaly that big. We are telling you, sir, the turbine's ignition chamber is dead. This is a waste of precious time." He was pleading now, his voice tight with the humiliation of being contradicted by a child. He was clinging to his procedures, to his digital readouts, because the alternative, that he was so fundamentally wrong, was too much for his pride to bear. He needed her to be wrong. Elara didn't even acknowledge him. Her focus was entirely on the machine. She reached into her father's worn leather toolkit, her small hand disappearing inside before emerging with a single small wrench. It wasn't shiny or new. The handle was dark with age and smoothed by her father's grip. She didn't ask for a stool or a ladder. She stood on her tiptoes, her arm stretching to its absolute limit, and positioned the head of the wrench perfectly against the ice-encrusted sensor housing. Then, with a motion that was incredibly precise and confident, she gave it a single, sharp tap. The sound was barely audible over the howling wind outside, a tiny tink, but the result was immediate. A thin, perfect shell of ice cracked and fell away, glittering for a second in the hangar lights before vanishing on the concrete floor. She lowered her arm, tucked the wrench back into its pocket, and wiped her small hand on her jacket. The entire complex solution had taken less than 5 seconds. Then she turned her head and looked directly at the pilot sitting silently in the cockpit. She gave him a small, certain nod. The pilot, a man whose face was etched with the strain of the last few hours, looked from this little girl to Major Thorne, his eyes wide with a question he didn't dare speak. Major Thorne stared at the now clear sensor for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he met the pilot's gaze, and his voice, when it came, was firm, cutting through the hangar's tense silence like a blade. "Light it up, Lieutenant. One more time." The lieutenant's hand moved to the ignition sequence. The initial electronic whine filled the air, the same sound of failure we'd heard a dozen times before. I held my breath, my chest so tight it ached. The Master Sergeant had a smug, "I told you so" look already forming on his face. But then something changed. The whine didn't falter. It didn't choke. It kept climbing, getting cleaner, stronger. until a deep resonant thump echoed from the heart of the engine. It was a sound of life. The growl started low, a guttural vibration that you felt in your bones, and then it erupted. With a deafening, soul-shaking roar, the Black Hawk's turbine spun to life. The massive rotor blades began to turn, slowly at first, then blurring into a violent invisible disk that unleashed a hurricane inside the hangar. The sudden blast of the rotor wash was like a physical blow. Loose papers, dust and forgotten rags were whipped into a chaotic vortex. The mechanics who had been smirking moments before were thrown off balance, stumbling backward, shielding their faces from the stinging wind. The Master Sergeant was pushed back several feet, his uniform flapping wildly, his face a perfect picture of slack-jawed, utter disbelief. He stared at the roaring, living machine, then his gaze snapped to my sister. She hadn't moved. She stood calmly beside the Major, her father's old jacket whipping around her, a tiny, satisfied smile finally gracing her lips. The sound of that engine was the sound of his arrogance being utterly and completely obliterated. It was the roar of her truth. Major Thorne stood frozen for a second, his military composure, the hard shell he had maintained through hours of crisis, completely shattered. He looked from the fully operational helicopter, its engine screaming with power, to the small, quiet girl standing beside him. The overwhelming relief on his face was so profound, it was almost painful to watch. He slowly raised a hand, not to salute or to give an order, and placed it gently on Ilara's shoulder. His knuckles were white. In the deafening, glorious noise of the resurrected machine, he leaned down and yelled something into her ear that was lost in the storm. But I saw his expression. It wasn't just gratitude. It was awe. He was a commander of men and machines. And in that moment, he was looking at a force he couldn't begin to comprehend. The pilot didn't even wait for a formal all clear. As soon as the engines stabilized, he was on the radio, his voice cutting through the roar with a newfound urgency. Ridge Team, Angel 1 is green. I repeat, we are green. On our way to you now. ETA 6 minutes. He gave a sharp, grateful nod towards Ilara, a look of pure, unadulterated relief on his face, before turning his full attention to the controls. The Fu, massive helicopter lifted off the ground, the force of its departure shaking the very foundations of the hangar one last time before it angled up and disappeared into the grey, snowy sky. In its wake, an eerie silence fell. The mechanics, who just moments before had been full of scorn and derision, just stood there staring at the empty space where the Black Hawk had been, their faces pale and their eyes hollow with the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The Master Sergeant, the man who had called my sister a brat and threatened to throw her out, had slumped onto a nearby crate. He wasn't looking at anyone. He just stared at the greasy concrete floor, his hands dangling uselessly between his knees. He looked like a man who had not only been proven wrong, but had his entire worldview, his entire sense of self, dismantled by a child with a wrench. The other mechanics avoided his gaze, and they avoided ours. They busied themselves with meaningless tasks, checking gauges on equipment that was already packed away. Major Thorne, however, never left Ilara's side. He had guided her over to a small bench away from the others, and he just sat with her, a silent guardian. He didn't treat her like a child anymore. He treated her like a fellow soldier who had just won a critical battle. The wait was agonizing. Every crackle of the radio made my stomach clench. We all knew that getting the helicopter in the air was only half the battle. They still had to perform a high-altitude hoist in a blizzard, with winds that could slam the aircraft into the side of the mountain. Ilara sat perfectly still, her hands clasped around her father's toolkit on her lap. She seemed to be listening to something far away, her gaze distant. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the radio crackled to life with the pilot's voice, strained but triumphant. "Command, this is Angel 1. We have them. Both men are aboard and stable. We are inbound." A collective, ragged sigh of relief went through the hangar. It wasn't a cheer. It was quieter, more profound than that. It was the sound of two lives being pulled back from the brink, and every single person in that room knew exactly who to thank for it. When the Black Hawk finally returned, its landing lights cutting through the swirling snow, it felt like the entire base was holding its breath. The moment the skids touched down, the medic team swarmed the aircraft, pulling out the two wounded soldiers on stretchers and rushing them towards the infirmary. The flight crew disembarked, their faces etched with exhaustion but also with a kind of fierce, wild joy. The pilot, the lieutenant whose hands had brought the engine to life, walked straight past Major Thorne, straight past the humbled mechanics, and stopped directly in front of my sister. He was a big man, but he knelt down on one knee so he was eye level with her. "We wouldn't have made it without you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He didn't offer a handshake. He just held her gaze, a moment of pure, unfiltered gratitude between the operator and his savior. The next day, after the doctors confirmed both rescued soldiers would make a full recovery, Major Thorne called for a formation in the hangar. Everyone was there, the flight crew, the ground crew, the medics, and the entire team of elite mechanics, who stood stiffly at the back, their faces grim. Ilara and I stood beside the major. He didn't make a long speech. He just looked at the assembled soldiers and then down at my sister. "Yesterday protocol failed us. Technology failed us. Our experience failed us," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet space. "We were all deaf to what this machine was telling us, all of us except one." He reached up and with a slow, deliberate motion, he unfastened the official Angel 1 unit patch from the shoulder of his own flight jacket. He knelt down and offered it to Ilara. "This belongs to you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "You're its guardian now." That gesture meant more than any medal ever could. It was a transfer of honor, a public acknowledgement that changed everything. From that day on, Ilara was no longer just the cook's quiet daughter. She became a living legend on that base, respectfully and affectionately known as the Angel's Whisper. Soldiers would nod to her with a reverence they usually reserved for senior officers. The master sergeant was quietly reassigned a week later. But the most incredible change was with the other mechanics. They started coming to her not with arrogance but with genuine questions. They'd bring her schematics for engines they couldn't figure out, and they would listen, truly listen, to what she had to say. They had learned the hard way that the most important part of being a mechanic wasn't just knowing how to fix things, but knowing how to hear what was broken in the first place. That patch never left her jacket. It became a part of her, a symbol that everyone on that base understood. The incident with Angel 1 wasn't just a story they told, it was a fundamental shift in how things were done. People started listening differently, not just to machines, but to each other. The quiet medic who hesitated to speak up found his voice. The junior mechanics started trusting their instincts more than just the diagnostic readouts. Ilara herself didn't change much on the outside. She was still quiet, still spent her time with her dad's manuals. But there was a new stillness in her, a quiet confidence. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. She knew her worth, and now, so did everyone else. The hangar, once a place of rigid hierarchy and loud commands, became a place where even the softest whisper could be heard. The change was most profound in the men who had scorned her. They didn't just respect her, they sought her out. The master sergeant was gone, but the others remained, humbled and transformed. They would bring her engine schematics, pointing out a problem they'd spent days on, and she would trace a line with her finger and say something like, "The vibration is wrong here. Did you check the housing for stress fractures?" She taught them to use their hands and ears again, to feel the pulse of the machine instead of just reading its data. Major Thorne made sure she always had a place in the hangar. He saw her not as a good luck charm, but as a crucial part of their operational readiness. He understood that her gift was a strategic asset, more valuable than any piece of advanced technology they could fly in. Looking back, I realize what we all learned that day in the heart of the storm. We learned that the most powerful tools aren't always found in a box, and that the biggest failures often come from the smallest oversights, the ones our own pride makes us blind to. We had the best technology, the most experienced men, the strictest protocols. We had everything we thought we needed to win, but we were deaf. We were listening for a roar of catastrophic failure, while the truth was a simple whisper of starvation, a quiet plea for help that only a child, unburdened by ego and expectation, was able to hear. It was a brutal lesson in humility, a reminder that sometimes the most complex problems have the simplest answers, if you're only willing to look for them. I'll never forget the sight of her, months later, sitting alone in the cockpit of Angel 1 on a quiet afternoon. The hangar was empty. The engines were cold. She wasn't touching the controls or pretending to fly. Her eyes were closed, and one small hand was resting gently on the instrument panel, right over the engine gauges. She was just sitting there in the silence, listening. It was her way of checking in, of continuing the conversation. She was the guardian of that machine, not just of its mechanics, but of its spirit. In that moment, I understood that her connection wasn't just to her father's memory anymore. It was her own calling, a unique path she was walking, one where she spoke a language that connected the world of cold metal with the fragile pulse of human life. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, someone whose voice is being ignored, or whose talent is being overlooked, please share this story with them. Remind them that true strength isn't always loud, and that the world changes not by the force of command, but by the courage of those who dare to listen to the whispers. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path, even when it's not the one others expect. Thank you for listening.